Hi guys, welcome to the Splendid Sampler 2 Sew Along with me, Jenni Smith. This week is called Free as a Bird by Irene Blank. Here it is, my finished block. So I worked on this yesterday for a couple of hours, making my templates, and then I've got up early this morning in good light just to do my applique stitching around it. You can do needle turn or you can do raw edge applique, whichever your preferred method is. I've done needle turn. I've taught you through making the stem, cutting on the bias, making templates and putting it all together in what order to put it on the block, what to look out for when you're positioning the bird. And I've actually just done something a little bit different with my Aurifil 12 way, and I've put in the leaves and some little details on the flower head, just because I really like the clamshells block where there was some applique mixed with the embroidery threads, and I've used similar Liberty fabrics for this block, different dark background, but I thought it would be nice to kind of make the two complementary. So I hope, as always, that my little sew along video is useful to you. Thanks for staying with me. It's lovely when I hear back. For this week's block, if you're going to do needle turn applique, then it's good to have some larger pieces of plastic. So in the past I've recycled small strawberry cartons, but I'm actually just going to cut open this milk carton now, flatten it out, give it a good clean, and then that will work for my templates. The bird in this week's block is made up of obviously different sections. So this will be one applique shape, and then the bigger wing, and then this one. So you can't just use this as it is, because obviously if you cut it up, then you're going to be missing sections of your wing and your bird and the tail feathers here. So the first step is going to be to trace off the main shapes. So your smaller circle here, this small wing and this large wing, the bird's body, a large tail feather and a small tail feather, and your leaves are fine. You can use those as they are because they don't overlap, onto a plain piece of paper separate. So you can use a light box or your window. Okay, so you can see here I have just traced them off. I kind of forgot here initially and started drawing the wing on top, but obviously each piece needs to be separate, so I'll discount that and I'll be cutting out the bird shape, the large wing, the small wing, the tail feather, underground piece, and then the other tail feather. And actually I decided it's easier just to also do the leaves and the circles onto this paper, and then I can keep the original pattern intact if I want to repeat the block or see how it lays out together, exactly where to put things back. So when you're tracing and there's a dotted line, then obviously that's what you're following for that shape, and the same on these tail feathers here. When I do trace shapes, it's same on dressmaking patterns, I don't necessarily, especially on bigger shapes, draw the entire shape. It's quite hard sometimes if you're leaning up against the window, and it's much quicker just to do the outline like this, because then when you're cutting it with your scissors anyway, then that bridges the gap between them. So just mark them. As long as you've got the crucial points like the corners intact, then you can cut those out and transfer them, I'll show you next, onto the plastic. So I have shown you this trick before, but now that my template is cut out on the paper, you don't need to flip the direction on this. I put it onto a piece of masking tape, sticky side down, and then I'm going to stick that onto, sorry I'm one-handed today, and I'm going to stick that onto the milk carton to a piece that's going to fit it nicely, and then the template doesn't shift around, and you can just simply cut around the shape and you've got your plastic template ready to go. And I'm going to repeat that for all of the parts of the birdie. See that once it's stuck on, you can see the shape nicely, and you can then go in with your scissors, obviously still your bad scissors that you don't mind spoiling, cutting through plastic, and you can just follow the outline of the shape and then discard the rest of the masking tape. It's cut out, you can see that the paper and the masking tape will just come away really easily, and this isn't sticky. It's now a piece of template ready to use, and you've still got the paper intact if you again need to use that for anything else. So I've now got all my shapes from my template plastic from half a carton of milk, and it's good recycling. And there's the bird. And just a note, if you're just going to do raw edge applique, like the balance block with the elephant, then just remember that when you're at the next stage, you don't need seam allowance, but when you're using this template to draw around on the wrong side of your fabric, ensure you flip the orientation of the pieces so that your bird will end up facing the correct way once it's finished. But I'm going to do needle turn applique, so the next step is to pop these onto the fabrics that I'm going to use for each part of the bird. Another decision to make, and add a 1/4 inch seam allowance before cutting out. When you are then cutting out the shapes, you can use the template to draw around. Just remember on the wrong side of your fabric to reverse it so that your bird's facing the right way in the end, and leave enough to also mark your 1/4 inch, because you now need the seam allowance on here, unless you're just doing, if you're going to stick it on and do raw edge applique. But if you're doing needle turn, then you need to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I just draw around the original shape and then add on that 1/4 inch. On lighter fabrics, I tend to just use my pencil lightly, and on darker fabrics, I like this Prim Sashko pencil with a white chalk fine point, and then some snips to cut out the shapes. I haven't actually cut out the background square fabric yet, but I quite like at this stage just to have a couple of options. I liked this block I made last time here with the dark blue background. I think it really set the colours off nicely, so I think for this, rather than using the same one, I'm going to go with the same print, the Liberty Quilting Cotton Garden Gates, it's called, Gated Shadow, but I'm going for the green. And I've just cut out, when I can't decide at this stage, like here, I cut out the white, but then actually I've cut out the shape as well in yellow, and I think that works. Then you need to cut a strip that's 1/2 inch wide by 8 inches, and because it curves, I am actually going to just cut it on the bias. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the true bias at a 45-degree angle, because that obviously wastes more fabric, but it will still have a better effect if you cut it partly on the diagonal to then press and make the stem. I guess you could also use some narrow bias binding if you've got some for this step. This diagram here is incredibly useful when you are starting to construct the block, so it's important to cut the background square bigger, like it says, to 7 inches, so that obviously if it frays whilst you're doing all the applique, then you can then cut it down to the finished size at the end. And the measurements here for the placement are based on it being 7 inches, so if you cut it down to 6.5, this placement would be confusing. So I've just got my background square now, and I've used my chalk marker to mark the height at which the top of the bird's head sits and the top of the circular flower, so that you know this stem here that I've just pressed, which on the bias is stretching nicely to form a curve, can work along here. And I know the curve's got to be a certain shape to veer off at this end point here, which again is marked on here at 3.5 inches down from the top. So the first part is to base this in position, and then obviously build the bird up on top of that. As always, when I'm basting, I use basting thread or a cotton thread so that it's not going to harm your fabric when you pull it out afterwards. And I'm going to do that now and move on. I have pinned this curve in position so you can see it's veering off just below that marker line there, coming down and round. I've done a double check that the bird will still have room for legs. Obviously it'll be smaller because of the seam allowance, but they will end up roughly where it needs to be there. And then I'm basting the top edge of the curve, big stitches, so it takes hardly any time at all, and then across and along that bottom curve to secure that in place. The 8 inches that you actually cut for the stem, you can see is plenty long enough, so I've made sure that I've avoided the little bits of the selvage here. They'll be covered by the circle here, and I'll stitch, you know, leave a bit extra now to cover underneath the circles, and I can get rid of this excess on the end afterwards. Using my appliqué foil trick again for now. So I've got the template plastic and my fabric. I've done a couple of snips just around this point here into the curve so that they'll go okay. And then on a hard surface, fold the foil up around the shape so that it goes all the way around. Press that with the iron, and then that will be ready to baste on as well. With the large tail feather, I'm not going to worry too much about the top edge because that will be tucked under the bird here, and I've just chopped a little bit off these ends here before I press around the template plastic to get that shape. The instructions actually tell you to put on the stem and then the tail feathers next, but I really wanted to get the bird into position just so that I can visualize the placement better and ensure that its head's in the right place here. And actually when you look at this, the tail feathers are over here anyway, just to the right of the body, so they can come on next. They don't need to tuck in underneath there, they're covered by the wing. I've basted it round. I've just got to do this last part here. This is always the scariest part for me, but where I've got a few imperfections, I know that once I then go in and stitch that by hand with a blind stitch, that I can neaten that up. And my template I've just kept handy. It was quite difficult just to press this shape with the foil here, but it's not far off. I'm happy enough with that. So now I'm going to just finish off this last bit here and then go on to the larger tail feathers. I find it's really easy to get completely stressed out when you're basting and you end up with little areas like this where you've got the raw edge, but it all comes good when you come to stitch it by hand, and you can take your needle and you can tuck that under and catch your stitches. So I just think if you were too perfectionist about it at this stage, you wouldn't get on with the project and the block would never be finished. So just keep the faith and keep going. What I'm doing when there's layers, like when the small tail feather is going to sit on top of this large one, I'm basting them in position, the same with the stem, and actually I'm going to assume that by doing this stitching here, that's going to secure what's underneath there. I don't feel that I need to stitch this first and put this over because they're quite small pieces, and I think once I then stitch around this edge here, that's going to be sufficient to hold everything in place. So I'm just building up the bird layer by layer. It's possible to create your wings with the tin foil, aluminum foil as you say in the States, trick there. So I'm just about to press that and take it out, and I'll do the same with the smaller wing piece as well. So we're getting there. I've just pinned this in position now to baste, and I'm not going to worry. This is basted also underneath, but I don't think I need to stitch that down because the wing will cover over that. So when I stitch around the bird, I can start here and go around what you see, because that will hold it in position, and then it will be quilted in the end on top as well. It's quick actually, just putting this in the foil and pressing it, and then you can just ease the plastic out and position it, but it does work very, very well. I'm just looking at the leaves as well, thinking as I go along that I might actually just embroider the outline and the stem of these leaves with embroidery thread rather than appliquing those in position, because there's quite a lot going on with the bird, and I think just something a little bit lighter will work. So I'm going to not make my leaves as planned. I'll just use the template to draw around, and then I'm going to do some hand stitching details for those. Okay, so I've got everything in position. I've found that actually definitely not cutting into this at the beginning is really helpful for when you're placing everything onto your background square, because there's quite a lot to position, and I've just been able to, for example, measure this distance and cross-reference that here. I've decided, like I've just mentioned, that I want to embroider in my leaves, and also the second small circle on the flower or the berry here I'm just going to do as well in an embroidery thread, because I just feel like I like the colours and what I've got going on there, and I can just add some details by hand afterwards. So now I'm going to look at my lovely selection of Aurifil 80 weights, because that's what I'm going to need, and I'm going to choose some colours for doing all of this blind stitching, because obviously in some places I've got quite a contrast between dark and light, so I'm just going to see which thread will disappear the most and change up the colours around the different parts as I go. Okay, so I am very spoilt for choice here with these 828 threads. Ooh, what to choose. This is my special gift this time when I was at the Festival of Quilts, but they're really beautiful to use, and like I say, when you're doing a lot of appliqué, then to have the colours that will disappear is really useful, to have a good choice of them. If not, obviously, then your mid-grey, your 6200 is a good. So it's early morning, I've just got up to finish this stitching in good light, so I've been doing some blind stitch all around here. The white threads actually worked fine on most areas, and I'm just on where the stem goes off the edge of the block. Obviously this is going to be trimmed down by 1/4 of an inch, so I'm just finishing off 1/4 of an inch before, so that when I cut that, my applique here doesn't start to unravel before the block's sewn into the rest of the quilt. Got the bird all stitched down now, and then I've just used my chalk to mark in the legs, and as I said, I'm going to do the leaves as well by hand, so I've just also marked those in the correct position. And now I'm going to use some, well, I've got this Aurifil 12 weight here to stem stitch the legs, and then I'll choose some colours here to do the leaf details. So I've done the legs and the leaves with a little stem stitch around the edges there, and then in the centre of the flower here, rather than putting that second circle on top, I'm going to use some nice colours that are in my fabrics here and do some little French knots, and then that will be done. So my block is all finished. I've done some little French knots in the centre of the flower, and obviously now the last job is just to get rid of the excess. So it's about 1/4 of an inch all the way around for it to be finished at 6.5 and then 6 once it's sewn into the quilt. So like I said, I did finish off this seam 1/4 of an inch early, so that when I cut through that applique there, then that won't come loose.